If you've ever noticed that you don't really feel the need to be on social media, that while others are constantly checking, posting, scrolling, you feel a kind of distance from it. Not resistance exactly, just a lack of pull. Like you're aware it's there, but it doesn't fully belong to your routine. It might seem like a small difference, but it often says more about you than you think. Because for some people, not using social media isn't just a habit. It's a psychological pattern. On the surface, it looks simple. You just don't use it much. You don't post often. You don't feel the need to share updates. You don't check it the way others do. And when people ask, you might just say, I'm not really active on social media. But when you look a little deeper, it's rarely that random. You might notice small behaviors that come with it, like hesitating before posting something and then deciding not to, or overthinking how something might be perceived and choosing to keep it private, or simply not feeling the urge to document moments, even the meaningful ones. Not because those moments don't matter, but because expressing them publicly doesn't feel necessary. And that subtle difference points to something deeper. Because social media, for a lot of people, isn't just a tool. It's a space for identity, a place where people present who they are or who they want to be seen as. So when you don't feel drawn to that, it often means your sense of identity isn't built around external validation in the same way. You might be more internally anchored. Your sense of self doesn't rely as much on being seen, acknowledged, or reacted to. And that changes how these platforms feel. Because if your identity isn't tied to visibility, then posting becomes optional, not necessary. And without that internal need, there's nothing pulling you back to it. But there's another layer to this. Some people who don't use social media much are more aware of how they're perceived, not in a loud way, but in a quiet, constant way. They think about how things come across, how they might be interpreted, what assumptions people might make. And that awareness creates friction, because instead of posting freely, there's a pause, a filter, a moment of, do I really want this out there? And often, the answer is no, not out of fear, but out of selectivity. Because once something is shared, it's no longer just yours. And for some people, that matters. They value the boundary between what's experienced and what's exposed. And over time, that boundary becomes part of their identity. I'm just not someone who posts much. I prefer to keep things private. I don't need to share everything. And those statements feel simple, but they're shaped by deeper patterns around control and emotional safety. Because social media reduces control in subtle ways. You can't control how people interpret something. You can't control how far it spreads. You can't fully control how you're perceived. And for some people, that lack of control feels uncomfortable. Not overwhelming, just unnecessary. So they choose environments where expression feels more contained, more intentional, more direct. You might notice this in how they connect with people. They prefer one-on-one conversations, deeper interactions, moments that aren't being watched or recorded. Because connection, for them, isn't something to be displayed. It's something to be experienced. And that changes what feels meaningful. A conversation matters more than a post. A memory matters more than a story upload. A shared moment matters more than a reaction. Not because one is better, but because their mind assigns value differently. And here's where it gets interesting. A lot of people assume that not using social media means you're disconnected, that you're missing out on something. Updates, trends, social circles. But the real reason often isn't about missing anything. It's about not needing that specific form of connection. Because connection doesn't only exist online. And for some people, it feels more real when it's not mediated through a screen. So instead of constantly checking what others are doing, their attention stays closer to their immediate environment, their thoughts, their conversations, their present moment. And that creates a different rhythm. Slower, more contained, less reactive. There's also something else happening beneath the surface. People who don't use social media often have a different relationship with attention. They're more selective with where it goes. Because these platforms are designed to pull attention outward constantly. Notifications, updates, endless scrolling. And for some people, that level of stimulation feels draining. Not exciting, not engaging, just excessive. So their mind naturally pulls back. Not as a rule, not as a discipline, but as a preference. They choose what feels sustainable, what doesn't overload their system. And that selectivity becomes a pattern. You might notice they're not quick to respond, not always available, not constantly updated. But when they engage, it's more present, more intentional, less scattered. And from the outside, that can look like disinterest or distance. But internally, it's just alignment. Their attention moving toward what feels meaningful and away from what doesn't. Over time, this shapes how they see themselves. I don't really need social media. I'm fine without it. It's just not for me. And those statements feel true because they are. But they're also built on how their mind processes identity, attention, and connection. It also explains why they might feel slightly out of sync sometimes. In conversations centered around posts, trends, online moments, they don't always have much to add. Not because they can't, but because they never built that connection to begin with. And instead of forcing it, they stay quiet, or observe, or shift the conversation. And that observation itself is part of the pattern. They tend to watch more than they display, experience more than they share. And that doesn't make them disconnected. It makes them selective. Selective with their visibility, selective with their energy, selective with what they allow to represent them. And that selectivity shapes everything. Because when something doesn't feel necessary, their mind doesn't try to force importance onto it. It simply lets it go, which is why social media, for them, often stays in the background. Not rejected, not criticized, just not essential. And once you start to see it that way, it stops looking like a simple habit and starts looking like a pattern, one that reflects how someone relates to attention, to identity, and to the idea of being seen. Because behaviors like this, they're rarely random. They come from somewhere. And awareness of that has a way of changing how you understand yourself and other people too. Because what looks like not using social media might actually be something much deeper, something intentional, even if it wasn't conscious, something shaped over time. And once you see that, you don't really unsee it. If this explains something you've noticed in yourself, there's always more beneath the surface. Understanding yourself is where everything starts.